Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The story was about a girl named Eleanor Brodian. She was the first princess of the kingdom. This girl was also a character from a novel called The Tyrant Emperor Became Possessed. The main character of that story was a tyrant emperor, and the heroine was very determined to escape from this man. The emperor said that he would give her everything she wanted, and in order not to delay and quickly leave this man, the main character pointed towards the carriage. However, everything did not turn out as she wanted. Her finger pointed to another place on the map, which was called the Kingdom of Brodian. The emperor, of course, mistakenly decided that she did not want a carriage to escape to, but the country that was depicted on the map at that moment. Of course, Eleanor was very upset when he got it all wrong. After all, this man was crazy, but at the same time, very stupid. Thus, Brodian as a state was destroyed in just 5 chapters of this very story. And unfortunately, the princess of that destroyed country turned out to be none other than Eleanor. But the girl was completely unhappy to have such a bloody status. She cried constantly and did not understand why she... In fact, at the age of 5, looking at a world map, the girl accidentally found out that she was a character in a novel. Before that, she could not even guess. The maid who looked after Eleanor when she was little constantly taught her and told her that, with the exception of the western lands, everything else was part of the empire of Insibilis. She also explained that they lived in the kingdom of Brodian. The girl took this quite calmly in front of the maid, but inside she was overcome with anxiety. She was simply furious because at that moment she realized that she was in the novel she was reading. In fact, in her past life, when she was 25 years old, she went to the hospital due to a serious illness that could not be cured. And until the end of her days, she decided to read the novel that she had liked very much throughout her life. She knew the story so well that she could even simply quote some lines without looking at the screen. But Eleanor was furious when she found out that she had fallen into a romance, namely Brodian. She desperately hoped that it was just another country with a very similar name, but in reality, her hopes were, of course, not justified. The girl turned out to be the desperate 5-year-old Eleanor Brodian, who was destined for a simply terrible fate. At that moment, she made a promise to herself that she would not be able to die such an early and miserable death as was written in history. So she copied the original and all the similar novels she could remember onto paper in order to come up with some kind of plan later. Eleanor told everyone in advance about future events, for example, that the new emperor would destroy their country. She did not keep silent about it for a second. The girl tried to prove to her parents and all the other aristocrats that in 14 years they would resume their conquest of the kingdom of Brodian and they simply would not be able to resist. But of course, no one listened. Everyone thought she was just a little child who had recently learned to write and count. And they also thought that she simply had a well-developed imagination and lacked attention. But in fact, as a result of the emperor's massacre, 4 countries were to be erased from the map forever. And 3 countries in the original story lost their independence and became colonies, completely subordinate to the empire. Among the conquered countries was a state called Lox, and it was the homeland of the main character, whose name was Roxy. But the situation there was still more or less good, since the girl was the empress in her state. Thus, the fate of all 7 countries was decided one after another. No one was embarrassed to shed blood and go to the end. When Eleanor grew up a little, she understood that Brodian's turn would soon come, since many states had already fallen or come under the rule of the empire. The girl, of course, was in despair, because she absolutely did not want such a fate for herself and her loved ones. Of course, knowing the plot, she was incredibly angry at the main character, who, accidentally pointing to the carriage, pointed to their state. The girl simply could not believe that this emperor was so crazy that he was ready to walk over people in order to satisfy his wife. But Eleanor was also very angry that the main character's finger pointed at their kingdom, and she did not know how to act in such a situation. When the girl was on the mountain with the rest of the warriors who were already ready for the confrontation, a man approached her and handed her some secret note. After reading this message, Eleanor learned that the other side was willing to negotiate if she, as a princess, would deign to come to them alone. When the girl found out about this, of course, she did not have a single note of doubt. She threw away this note and was already completely sure of what she would do. And after a short time, Eleanor found herself in the commander's tent in the military camp of the Insibilia Empire. As she had promised, she came there alone. The girl stood in front of the man. He was quite handsome, but he also knew his place, so he looked at the girl with a very arrogant look. Eleanor knew very well who it was. It was the youngest swordmaster, Sion. Even though there was only one line written about him in the novel, she still remembered this character. The girl also knew that he was supposed to die quite early, so when she came and saw him alive, she was very glad that she was not late. The girl quickly took off her hood to show her identity. The man, of course, was not surprised for a moment that it was her, but only looked at her coldly. After he extended his hand to her, pointing to the chair in front of him, meaning for her to sit down, the girl realized that he wanted to put a lot of pressure on her. But Eleanor was completely different. She could also compete in this competition of stubborn people, so she simply stood there and did not follow his order. For a while there was complete silence in his tent. After that, the man explained to the girl that he was very surprised because he could not even imagine that the first princess of the kingdom would deign to come to his region. Eleanor said that she had been there before these events. With a smile on her face, the girl explained with an unperturbed look that in honor of her coming of age, she had decided to take a trip around the country. In fact, she had come to that place in advance in order to surrender without a fight and various stubbornness, because she knew that all this could end very badly. In order to defend her stubbornness, Eleanor said that she also didn't think that the youngest swordmaster of the entire continent would come to such an impromptu negotiation. Sion did not respond to this because he understood that despite the fact that the girl did not show it, she still knew that he would come there. When the man asked if she knew him, Eleanor replied that she knew perfectly well that he was stalling for time in order to stop a war that had started for no good reason. He immediately realized that she must have had a spy who was able to report all this information to the girl. Meanwhile, Eleanor tried to remember the smallest details of the plot in order to know how to proceed further. In fact, Sion was one of the most brilliant swordsmen of the two in the entire empire, and the reason why such a gifted man died was because he disobeyed the emperor's order. In fact, when Eleanor first read the story, she believed with all her heart that he would be the main male hero. And she was completely ready to become his fan, but in the end this man turned out to be just a spare character who died on the very first pages of the book. At that moment, when Eleanor stood before him and saw all his beautiful, eternal appearance in real life, she did not understand how the author of this story could kill such an ideal character. And the author did this only because he refused to carry out the imperial order to conquer the land that the empress wanted. In fact, Sion was simply taken and used as a victim in order to show all the cruelty, obsession, and ruthlessness of the emperor, who was blinded by his love. Eleanor, like many readers, felt very sorry that such a character with excellent data was killed off so quickly. Eleanor was unable to feel sorry for others at that point, so she explained to the man that they wanted to surrender, as she saw no point in causing so much bloodshed. The girl explained that because of her sense of pride, she was not going to sacrifice the lives of her people, who were not at all to blame for the arrival of the emperor. When the girl finished speaking, she heard a voice that was not Zion's. It was a rough, hoarse voice that belonged to another man. For some time, Eleanor could not understand who had called her arrogant and stupid. But after the girl turned to the side, she saw this man. It was the emperor, and he said that he did not send Sion to achieve their capitulation. Eleanor certainly did not expect to see the emperor himself in the tent where she was supposed to be alone with the knight. So, angry, she pointed her finger at him, completely forgetting about all manners and the fact that he was a murderer, and loudly asked what he was doing there anyway. Sion, in fact, was himself very surprised that the emperor appeared there because the man had not warned him at all about his arrival. Of course, over time, the girl realized that she had done something completely wrong and the emperor's face, which expressed a very wide range of emotions, helped her realize her mistake. The emperor of the empire was a man. He had dark hair and beautiful green eyes that looked like emeralds. The man's name was Matteo Roidus, and he was crowned at only 18 years old, which was quite unusual for such a status. The young emperor did not have a biological mother, so the dowager empress, who was his stepmother, had great rights to interfere in politics. And all this happened thanks to convergent management, which was used in cases where the emperor was too young. Not only did this woman not value poor Matteo at all, but she also regularly sent him to her room, taking him there alone for quite a long time. And when Matteo was alone in that room, the woman sent her niece, who was the daughter of Duke Dari Zen, there so that he could impregnate her. And that is why no one was surprised that the emperor killed the dowager empress when he came of age. It was a terrible act, but people took it quite adequately, because they knew the whole situation that was happening in his house and did not even judge Matteo. The war between them would only end if one of them died. And in fact, that is what happened. And this act also became the first step in becoming a tyrant for the poor guy who used to think about everyone, love, and care for people. Therefore, Eleanor, knowing this whole situation, was incredibly frightened and understood her mistake when she greeted the emperor very rudely. She knew she should have said hello first, and not just ask for help from a man who could easily take her life. But the girl quickly corrected this situation. She bowed, greeted His Highness, and said that she was the princess of the kingdom of Brodian. Matteo didn't react to her at all. He simply walked through the girl and stopped in front of Sion, who was already kneeling and understood that this would all end badly. For a while, the emperor simply looked at the man, but after that, he took out his expensive and incredibly sharp sword and also addressed the guy. The man explained that he had received his letter of advice and asked, did he really dare to advise him to stop the senseless war? Sion said with a trembling voice from fear that this was indeed so, because he could not lie to the emperor, because he knew that it was wrong to do so. Matteo actually hated being ordered around the most, and he also thought that only horrible old men who had nothing left to lose could do that. Sion realized that he had made a mistake, so he began to ask for forgiveness from His Majesty. But of course, it was useless to do so. Matteo stared at the boy without taking his eyes off him. He said that he really hoped that he understood the consequences of his reckless request. Sion already felt a strong pain in his cheek because the sword touched his delicate skin and managed to make a cut. The boy sat with his head bowed and his eyes closed. He said that he was fully prepared to accept any punishment from His Highness because he had made a mistake. Matteo really liked hurting people, so without thinking twice, he immediately swung at the guy to give him a proper punishment. Eleanor was incredibly scared at that moment. In order not to see this whole picture, she even closed her eyes. But the girl began to scream loudly in order to somehow influence the emperor. The girl did not understand why he continued to mock Sion because they had surrendered to him. Therefore, she began to beg the man with all her heart not to shed more innocent blood. When Matteo heard this, he immediately stopped before hitting the guy. He looked at the girl and eventually just lowered his sword. He switched from Sion to the princess and in a rough voice told her to continue talking and dig her own grave. Eleanor didn't actually mean to come to the knight's defense entirely. She just meant that she wanted to wait outside while the emperor killed the guy. When the girl said these words, she realized that she had made a big mistake, because in this way, she only provoked the man to aggression even more, but now towards her. Matteo pointed his sword at her and said that due to her father's sudden death, the war between them had been temporarily suspended, so they had been enemies for 15 years. After that, he asked the princess, wasn't he telling the truth? The girl was incredibly worried, and when she is afraid and nervous, she starts talking very quickly and loudly. So, Eleanor replied that the remaining northern part of the country was not producing much fruit. If the war continued like this, the land would be completely devastated. So she wondered if he really wanted a land where only ruins would remain. The emperor, having listened to her attentively, smiled. He, of course, understood that she was right, but his pride did not allow him to admit it. Therefore, he said that he was just going to destroy these lands in order to honor the legacy and memory of his father. He explained that his beloved empress wanted these lands for herself, so he simply decided to speed up the whole process and combine the two matters. However, he nevertheless appreciated her bravery, so he said that he would leave her people alive. As soon as Eleanor heard this, she was incredibly surprised. Meanwhile, he pushed the sword aside so abruptly that even a few hairs fell from her head. But the emperor also had his own condition for the fulfillment of this task. He said that he would leave only the common people alive, and explained that the aristocracy would not be included in this number. The man believed that everything needed to be stopped immediately in order to avoid trouble in the future. In fact, the sword that was pointed at Eleanor was the Scion sword. It was a sword made of mithril, which is known for stabilizing mana. Moreover, he could stabilize not only mana, but also physical and thermodynamic properties, and even restore them a little. So when Eleanor felt an incredible tingling sensation as the sword was near her skin, she wasn't surprised at all. Matteo also said that he forgot to warn her that she had no choice, so she could either agree to this option or he would return to his previous plan. The sword was pointed at her throat again, and she knew that no matter what happened, it would kill her. She needed to calm down, because in moments like these, you need to keep yourself under control in order to think rationally and find a way out. When the man confirmed what Her Majesty the Empress had said she wanted to get Brodian, the girl said she could offer him one suitable idea. Matteo then frowned and said that, of course, he didn't like it when petty people like her tried to negotiate with him. Eleanor understood that since she couldn't come to an agreement with the emperor, she needed to somehow involve the empress in the conditions so that he would have no choice and would simply agree. So the girl said that she would like to become the empress's servant, or perhaps he could send her to another country. Matteo, as soon as he heard about this, immediately became angry. He pointed his sword at her to kill her and said that he rejected her condition. The girl had no choice, so she started screaming, covering her face with her hands. She asked him not to kill her because she could go with him as a tribute. Matteo, hearing this, immediately smiled and, putting away his sword, said that years ago Brodian stood in second place after the empire in prosperity. And the man mockingly asked whether the princess, who was first in line to the throne of such a great country, really wanted to become some kind of tribute. Eleanor was furious. She didn't understand how he could say such things, because it was he and his father who had simply taken and destroyed this country, not giving it a chance to develop. After thinking about this proposal well, the man said that he could accept her offer to become a tribute to his empire. So turning to his top military commander, he said that they would immediately deploy troops. As he left the tent, Matteo laughed loudly, not understanding why she needed such an insignificant country at all, and why she tried to save it with all her might. It wasn't until the man left that Eleanor realized what she had done. She assumed she had been too nervous and had rushed her choice. Soon, she and Scion went to another tent where the beds were. Eleanor knew that she had to befriend the Empress at any cost first. She believed that if she did this well, she would be able to influence the Empress and return back to Brodian. While the girl was sitting on the edge of the bed and thinking about everything that had happened, Xian came up to her. He explained that His Highness had gone to the main palace and had sent an envoy before leaving. He also asked the girl if she knew how to ride a horse. Of course, Eleanor didn't like the idea right away, but she said that she knew the basics of how to do it. Hearing this, he immediately became happy. He said that after all, she was the princess of a country, and it would be inconvenient to put her in a cart with things. In fact, Eleanor was quite content with one emperor who considered her his trophy, so she certainly would not have tolerated any greater humiliation. If it weren't for this war, the girl could have even become the Queen of Brodian, and perhaps, over time, she would have returned the country to greatness again. Of course, Zion, looking at this whole situation from the outside, also understood that for her country, this was an absolute victory, since they did not shed anyone's blood. However, Brodian's future was very bleak, and he believed that it would be too hard for the girl to bear all this. To console poor Eleanor a little, he said that he did not at all consider her a trophy or something to be gotten rid of. The girl ignored his words because she didn't care. She just wanted to warn him that he might not feel guilty before her because he was definitely not guilty of anything. Zion bowed and said that he had no right to let her go to see her homeland, so this was the only thing he could do for her. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and even panicked. She did not understand why he was saying this, because he had just recently claimed that the emperor had sent an envoy. With a sad expression on his face, Zion explained that it was his initiative, because she probably wanted to write something to her family and friends, and to the people in general, as a farewell. Eleanor didn't understand why he was doing all this, because she had already told him that she didn't have to feel guilty towards her for what had happened. But as Zion himself explained, he wanted to repay her debt, because she saved his life. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised then, because she had completely forgotten about it. So she decided to clarify one small detail. Eleanor, laughing nervously, explained that she didn't really care who the emperor killed. She wanted it to happen, just not on her watch. Zion, of course, did not like her confession, and in a detached voice he said that he knew everything, because she said that she could wait outside while they killed him. But he still continued to hold the pen and piece of paper in his hands so that she could write a few farewell words. Eleanor immediately thought that he was trying to feel sorry for her, so she jumped up from the bed and started screaming at him very loudly, claiming that she didn't care at all whether he killed him or not. The girl also said that she was absolutely sure that Zion himself would hardly disobey the order to seize their lands in order to save his own life. Therefore, it would be better for her if he simply died, because her country would be very happy about the death of the swordmaster. But Zion didn't seem to be listening to her at all. He kept handing her a piece of paper and asked her to take it, because he couldn't live with a sense of duty. Eleanor was so upset that she couldn't take it anymore, and said that in that case he might not live. The man decided to change the subject of the conversation, so he said that, if you think about it, they don't have a horse for the girl at all, so she will have to walk to the capital of the empire. After these words, Eleanor no longer denied the fact that she needed to write a letter, so, taking the piece of paper, she said that since he did not want to be indebted to his enemy, then they would be even. Before heading to the empire, they approached the gates in order to be allowed out of the territory of another country. He took out his bow and started aiming an arrow straight up. Eleanor immediately panicked because she thought they might think he was attacking. But the man was completely calm and replied that if they were smart, they would immediately figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, he had already managed to release the arrow, and it, having flown to the very top, hit the target straight. As soon as Eleanor saw this clear hit, she was incredibly surprised. She even opened her mouth, but did not say anything, did not even praise the man, because she knew that he was her enemy. After some time had passed, the large gates finally opened, and a fast horse immediately began to run out of there. Zion immediately turned to the knights he had taken with him and asked them to check if there was anything suspicious in the bags that were on the horse. Eleanor, when she heard this warning, immediately moved away from the horse. She was incredibly scared and asked the man what could be inside. He was completely calm and said that he, of course, did not know, and therefore ordered the knights to check everything in order to know whether the horse was safe. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately began to panic because she felt very ashamed, because she thought that these bags could contain her underwear, and these knights would so unceremoniously rummage through her things. As soon as she turned her head to the side and saw that one of the guards began to take out some kind of gray bag, she panicked incredibly strongly. The girl, plucking up her courage, immediately intervened in this process and began to shout at Zion, hitting him on the cheek, saying that this was all tactless. The girl also believed that he had completely forgotten that she was of royal blood, and that was why he was acting this way. Meanwhile, the man had a huge red spot on his cheek from this blow, and he stood there, incredibly surprised, not understanding what was happening and why she reacted like that. But Eleanor, meanwhile, swung at him again, not understanding how ordinary commoners dared to search the princess's things at all. The men who were searching the things immediately looked at the girl and, in surprise, dropped some of her personal belongings on the ground. Eleanor was emotional and realized she had made a mistake when she yelled at Zion. But he turned to his assistants in a gruff voice and told them not to touch anything and just wait. Meanwhile, she took all her belongings from the horse and spread a blanket not far from everyone, near the pine tree, in order to rest a little. She sat and was very sad. The girl was even ready to cry because she could not believe that she really would have to walk a huge distance. And then suddenly, a beautiful feminine voice addressed Princess Eleanor. A girl with pink hair and a basket in her hands approached her. She recognized the princess. The girl sat down opposite her and, turning to Eleanor, said that her name was Beatrice. She also said that she could call her if she suddenly needed something, even if it was a small thing. Eleanor was a little surprised that a girl had been sent to her and immediately thought that she was probably also a commoner. Meanwhile, Beatrice handed the princess a basket and said that Zion was actually a little slow today, so she apologized to the girl on his behalf. After that, she stood up and, bowing, began to leave. The girl actually thought that Eleanor was incredibly lucky that she managed to survive at all after meeting the formidable emperor, because many cannot even stay with him for a minute. Before leaving for good, Beatrice turned to the princess and, smiling slyly, said that she thought this trip would be very interesting. Quite a lot of time passed from that moment, and after a few days, Eleanor finally arrived at the imperial palace where they were already expected. The one dressed in the knight's uniform escorted her into the hall where the emperor was sitting with his wife. There were also many other guests present in that room who had gathered to watch all of this. The poor empress sat in Mattio's arms because he had forced her to do so, but she felt incredibly awkward because she knew that everyone around her was looking at her without taking their eyes off her. The girl also understood that all these people, who were aristocrats, condemned her, and not embarrassed by what she might hear, said all sorts of nasty things about the empress. So when Elidor saw the reality live, she even felt very sorry for the poor empress. Even though the girl had to think about her own safety, she still showed sympathy for the poor and unfortunate empress. Eleanor was a hostage from the kingdom, the princess of a captured country, and she was standing right next to the best swordsman in the empire, Sion. But the girl knew that even if someone attacked her, he would not help her. She had to rely only on her own strength. When Mattio saw his hostage, he immediately turned to his wife and said that instead of the lands of Brodian, which she so wanted, Sion brought her the heir to the crown of that kingdom. So, smiling, he said that he very much hoped that his beautiful empress would like such an idea. As soon as the girl heard all this, she was sincerely surprised. She immediately felt sorry for Eleanor, and turning to her husband, she said that this was not at all what she had asked for. Mattio was starting to get angry, so he squeezed her waist tightly and asked in a rough voice if she didn't want to get Brody as a wedding gift. He explained that the girl who stood next to Zion was Princess Brody and also gave her name. Mattio told the empress that she herself had expressed a great desire to become her servant, and he asked her if she liked this outcome at all. The empress looked with fear at poor Eleanor, who was standing only a few meters away from her, and asked with horror in her voice, "Does she really want to be her servant?" When people heard and saw Eleanor, they immediately began to whisper. They knew very well that she was to become the next queen of Brodiano. They were also very surprised that a person of royal blood would be just some lowly servant to the empress. The empress was silent for a while. Then she looked at Mattio and asked in surprise, "Does this mean that when she asked him for the map, he thought that she wanted Brodian?" It was then that the girl realized that she had made a huge mistake, and because of this, the emperor had misunderstood her. Mattio wanted to conquer this country. However, there was no point in giving the empress devastated lands, and his father had long ago captured the southern part of Brody, which was considered a grain region. So conquering this country would have resulted in senseless losses on their part. But he told the girl that if she wanted it so much, then he could do it. When the empress heard this, she immediately burst into tears. She explained to her husband that she only wanted a map from him and not Brodian. Mattio laughed heartily and said that she had incredible plans. He wondered if she was pointing at the entire map, meaning the unification of the entire continent. Eleanor, who stood and watched all this with astonishing attention, thought that she was a crazy emperor. So, with her character, she definitely would not want all this. Well, the empress remained silent. She was simply shocked by such terrible and unfortunate thoughts of her beloved husband. In fact, in the novel, the emperor's mad conquest of the country ended only with Brody, and then his madness was limited only within the empire. But Eleanor really hoped that all this madness would not affect her in any way, because she did not want her life to end so terribly. She really hoped that, apart from this one small object that the girl had changed, everything else continued according to the original story's plot so that she could live. The empress, when she finally came to her senses, immediately began to scream loudly and be indignant. The girl did not understand what kind of unification of the entire continent he was talking about. In front of all the witnesses, the girl explained that she only wanted the paper on which the map was drawn. Even Zion, who usually showed no emotion, was very surprised, and his jaw muscle clenched. The man simply could not believe that this idiot emperor would start a war for such a reason, in which many people died. He believed that this was an inhuman act that should be punished. Eleanor looked at the empress and understood that she was her only salvation. So she decided that she needed to make sad eyes in order to evoke pity and sympathy. The emperor asked his wife why she needed the map at all, because he really didn't understand. And the girl, with tears in her eyes, realizing her mistake, said that the golden lines along the edges were very beautiful to her, and that is why she wanted such paper for herself. Matteo didn't understand why she was even saying this, since there were plenty of more beautiful things in the palace, but he changed the subject by asking if the girl liked the princess, and also explained that he was giving her as a trophy. Eleanor had a rather rare hair and eye color, so the man told the empress that she would do anything for the girl. So he asked her to just take her and not be angry with him anymore. But the empress said in a cold and distant voice that she had no need of this girl at all. Matteo wasn't really that worried about all this and said that if she didn't need her, then there was nothing to be done. She would have to be executed. As soon as Eleanor heard this, she could not believe that he actually said that she should be executed, and yet she really did not want to die and perhaps even go to hell. She knew that everything was not going according to her plan now, and this scared the girl very much. She could not just die like that. A look of great horror appeared on Eleanor's face. The girl could not understand. Was it really true that the emperor would just take and kill her like an unnecessary animal? But the empress turned to her husband and said that she did not want this, so the girl simply asked him to send the princess back to her country and not to touch her anymore. Just as Matteo was thinking about this decision and was about to make his final statement, another woman appeared in the hall, and she interrupted him mid-sentence, turning to him. This mysterious person was Eliza Orbis, and she was also a duchess. In fact, Eliza was the very niece that Emperor Matteo's birth mother was looking after. This was the same cousin whom the emperor relied on because of her resemblance to his aunt, who, in turn, was incredibly similar to his mother. Therefore, this woman was the only person who could allow herself to be insolent right in front of the emperor and express her personal opinion. Eliza came closer to him, and with a smile on her face, asked if they had really gone mad. After all, if they killed the princess, on the one hand, a war could break out with Brodian, which had decided to surrender without bloodshed. Matteo, hearing this, was a little indignant and asked what he should do in that case. Should he really return her back, as the empress asked? But Eliza said that of course it was absolutely stupid to do that. They couldn't lose such a good trump card up their sleeve. And so the girl said that if they kept the princess as a servant, they could minimize the negative reaction from her country. And besides, it could increase the empress's authority. When Eleanor heard the words of this Eliza, she was incredibly happy, because being a servant is much better than just dying. So she really wanted the girl to still be able to influence the emperor. Meanwhile, she had already formed a very good plan in her head that was supposed to work, so she only hoped for a solution. However, Matteo, of course, did not agree to all this. He rejected the offer and explained his decision. So even the empress explained that she did not need this girl, so he saw no point in leaving her. But Eliza had another way to keep this woman with them. She offered to let Eleanor into his harem. But the emperor rejected this offer too, because he explained that because of Her Majesty, they had decided to abolish the harem. So he asked if there was any other way to make him change his mind. Eliza, sighing heavily, told them about her last option. And this option was that they should give the princess to the knight Scion. The woman explained her offer by saying that he had achieved capitulation without bloodshed, and that was a pretty good reason to award him the title. Eliza, laughing, also told the emperor that even if he had no merit, the man should still be given a title. Eleanor was actually furious at that moment. The girl did not understand why these two were talking only to each other and did not take into account anyone else's opinion. So she really hoped that the empress would be able to stand up for her and express her decision. The woman, of course, did so, but Eleanor's expectations were not fulfilled, for she smiled and said that she was very glad that a suitable condition had been found for everyone. For a while there was complete silence in that hall, because the emperor was thinking about this proposal and did not know how to act. Eleanor, of course, was against all this, because she was a gift to the empress, and did not expect that a woman could agree with her husband. The empress, with a smile on her face, said that if His Majesty agreed, then she would too, because this was a pretty good compromise for all of them. The woman had tears in her eyes and said that she was asking for forgiveness, but she didn't want to die, so she had to do it. Of course, Eleanor was very angry when she heard such an argument, because she knew better than anyone that she would definitely not die, because no matter what the empress did, that tyrant would never dare to kill her. But then suddenly Eliza entered the conversation again and asked what territory would be handed over to His Highness. And she also said that she could recommend several good places. After this, the woman named one city for a day, which was called Enthralling. When Eleanor heard this, she immediately froze in place. She really hoped that Elizabeth was not talking about the Enthralling that every dog on the continent knew about. In fact, this city that they all talked about was the northwestern region of the empire. It was the area that was adjacent to the Totalis forest and was known as the largest habitat of various monsters throughout the continent. Of course, it is not surprising that this place was also called the Gates to Hell, because the monsters there were truly just the most terrible, and very few managed to cope with them. In fact, the most sinister monsters lived in the Totalis forest and the cave called the Abyss. However, due to the fact that the cave was located deep in the forest, far from human eyes, no one knew its full size, because those who went there mostly never returned. And all that was known at that time were just guesses from geologists and ecologists who could not make a final conclusion, because they had not been there and had not seen all of this with their own eyes. Of course, there wasn't even a map of all those places, since research was not carried out due to the lack of geodetic equipment. Although the region was incredibly vast in area, the places that people could use were extremely small. In other words, if the emperor agrees to this, he will send the girl and Zion there for the rest of his days, so that they can protect themselves from the monsters. Matteo thought carefully about Elizabeth's proposal and said that if Zion agreed to go there, the time of the empire would be shortened. And with a smile on his face, he added that he was very sorry that he could not offer some other territory. But the man reacted to this quite calmly, because he had long known that nothing good could be expected from the emperor, so he simply bowed and thanked him. Of course, Matteo said that there was no need for any thanks, and also reminded the knight that even if the princess was from a conquered country, it did not change the fact that she was still of royal blood. And it was for this reason that the emperor could not marry her off to a low-ranking man, because it could harm the authority of his empire. Eleanor was very irritated by his pompous behavior, because just a minute ago he wanted to kill her, without thinking at all about his reputation. In fact, there was also another man in that room, and he was the Duke of Terry. In fact, his family was considered a family that could very likely even become the Empress's family. The concubine of the previous emperor, who ruled over young Matteo, was, in fact, the sister of this very Duke Terry. The Duke turned his back on his sister as soon as she began to lose to the emperor, and the emperor took advantage of this to stir up a functional struggle among the aristocrats. In the end, he left the Duke alive only because he was still quite useful to him. Matteo called this Duke Terry to him and said that he wanted to give his best general the title of Duke. He asked the man what he thought about such a decision. When the boy heard this, he was very surprised, because there were already 4 dukes, and the man could not believe that the emperor wanted to increase them to 5. And besides, Terry did not understand how he could want to make this low-ranking commoner a duke. So he turned to His Majesty with a trembling voice and said that the title of duke was too high for him. Matteo, hearing this, was genuinely surprised, but he wanted to know Terry's version of why he thought so in the first place. Of course, the Duke was angry when he heard this question, because it was obvious even to the famous great magician. The title of Count was simply the limit. But Terry kept his emotions in check. He bowed and said that in the history of the empire, there had never been more than 4 duchies. But the emperor was already getting angry. He said that such a law was not written, and so of course he saw no problem. He was going to be the first emperor to rule over 5 duchies. When Terry heard all this, he was very surprised, and looking at the emperor, he asked, "Is he really serious about all this?" Matteo, meanwhile, had already stood up from his seat and called the man very slow-witted. He approached one of the guards and took the weapon from him. After this, the emperor, with a smile on his face, told the boy that he had a great idea on how to make sure that there would only be 4 duchies left in their empire. He walked up to Terry quite quickly and, pointing his sword at him, said in a very rough and quiet voice that he absolutely should not have left him alive back then. The Duke, of course, immediately became afraid for his life because he did not want to die and did not see why he should, because he had done absolutely nothing wrong. Eleanor, who was standing nearby, was simply horrified. The girl did not understand why everything turned out like this. Zion, who was standing next to her, looked at the girl and saw the fear in her eyes. He immediately remembered the words she said about how she didn't care who was killed as long as it didn't happen in front of her. Therefore, as soon as the emperor swung at the poor duke to cut off his head, Zion quickly ran up to the girl and covered her face with his hands and his body. When Eleanor saw all this, she was horrified, but despite the fact that she saw nothing, the girl was even satisfied with just the sound of the head falling and Terry screaming his last words. She almost threw up, but Zion, when he saw her reaction, immediately pulled her closer to him and told her not to look under any circumstances, because he knew how vulnerable she was. Soon, when it was all over, he let her go and finally allowed the girl to open her eyes. Elizabeth, who was passing by at the time, looked at the couple in surprise and did not understand why the knight stood up for her like that. But Zion quickly turned to the woman and asked her to keep an eye on Princess Eleanor until they removed the body. Of course, Elizabeth didn't like all this. However, she still agreed to it and told him to hurry up because she didn't have much time. The knight left rather quickly to remove the corpse, and Eleanor remained in place with her head down and tears in her eyes. When the woman looked at this poor and miserable Eleanor, she immediately rolled her eyes and sighed. She thought everyone was just crazy. Eleanor herself, meanwhile, was trying to remember what happened in the original plot, because she knew for sure that the main villain, Duke Terry, could not die. But no matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't remember anything. Then suddenly the girl turned her head to the side, where the emperor had been sitting with his wife, and saw something strange. In fact, the empress, because she did not turn away or close her eyes, but saw this unfortunate murder live, lost consciousness from horror. Matteo justified his murder by saying that he could not have a second chance, and he also asked his assistants if the Duke had any heir. The emperor believed that his family should be completely exterminated so that the number of duchies would never exceed the mark determined by the norms as he himself wanted. In fact, Duke Terzin had a daughter, however. there was no longer any point in her life, since the emperor decided that Sion was the best fit for this role. And besides, the man was a master of the sword, which many countries wanted to get. So it was not at all surprising that the emperor wanted to completely tie Sion to his empire. Thus, Matteo also had a great opportunity to keep control of Azentarium. Eleanor, of course, did not like all this, because she believed that the emperor lived too carelessly and did not think at all about any consequences. In the meantime, the corpse had already been removed, and the emperor, turning to the remaining aristocrats, asked if there were any other objections to his decision. When no one answered, he immediately smiled and decided that in that case it was necessary to immediately call the high priest to bind Eleanor to Sion in marriage. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately remembered her original problem, namely this wedding. She immediately looked at her future groom, but saw no reaction from the man. He was completely indifferent to this situation. Of course, this was incredibly annoying for Eleanor because she wanted to be the Empress's servant for a while and then return to Brodian as queen, but now everything was completely different. But she knew that she shouldn't show weakness and her tears to the enemy, so she was able to contain her emotions. At this point, Elizabeth turned to her and said that there were no supporters of hers in that place at all. And the woman also handed her a handkerchief so that she could wipe away the tears that had nevertheless treacherously flowed. Eleanor took her handkerchief and said that she knew it very well. Of course, Elizabeth, like everyone else, had heard that she had come of age that year, so she decided to talk to her a little more. The woman sighed heavily and said that she actually liked her, unlike some people, but she warned Eleanor that as soon as she showed her weaknesses, she and Sion would be torn to pieces by the people around her. Eleanor, sighing heavily, also said that she knew all this very well, and if his value was undermined because of her tears, then it would be a loss not only for the emperor, but also for herself. The women were silent for a while. Then Elizabeth, smiling, said that it was all very well. She liked her restraint, so she turned to the future Duchess and said that she would now be in her debt. Meanwhile, she finally moved away from Eleanor and approached the emperor, who was deciding some issues. Seeing the girl, he was very surprised and immediately asked what had happened. Elizabeth replied that the title of Sion would be officially conferred the next day, and she asked that the organization of the wedding be left to the Empress. The woman explained that since this relationship was created by him, everyone needs to arrange an incredibly grand event so that people will remember it for a long time. She also explained that if Her Majesty took on the organization of this beautiful wedding, the girl would be able to win everyone's respect. After thinking for a while, the emperor finally agreed with her and said that she was indeed right. This was the right decision, so he approved the Empress's candidacy. Elizabeth, after this, said that the woman was very tired, so she returned to her place, so they decided to discuss the details a little later. Matteo, hearing that he was no longer needed there, simply went to his place, completely ignoring everyone around him. Meanwhile, Eleanor was wondering where her room would be now, and as soon as the man left the door, Elizabeth approached her again. The woman smiled and said that there was no room for guests in the palace because it was full of envoys from other countries. So she offered to stay with her for a while. Since Eleanor had no choice, of course she agreed to this option because she didn't really want to spend the night on the street. So when it was completely dark outside, the girl arrived at Elizabeth's estate and was already lying in her room. She thought over her plan. The first point was to get married, as the emperor wanted. After this, Eleanor was going to send a letter to Brody about not allowing the deprivation of the right to inheritance. She then became a duchess and became friends with the empress in order to carry out her plan for how the emperor would change. And the very last point was that after the emperor's interest in her person had diminished, she would somehow get divorced and leave for Brody in order to inherit her crown. Eleanor was incredibly hopeful that her plan would work and everything would be fine. And to her happiness, the ceremony of presenting the title of Sion went very successfully, without any incidents. However, He had a lot of things to do, so they didn't have any kind of celebratory party to celebrate it. The emperor was not going to allow this to happen, but he only said that if he wanted, he could only give them a day, since a party was the norm for such an event. But Zion responded rather reservedly and said that, of course, he would refuse this party if the emperor so wished. When Elizabeth heard this, she was simply furious, because she had been trying to achieve all this for a very long time. And the woman even decided that they had all gone crazy, because they had canceled her expensive party, for which she had tried and prepared for so long. Eleanor herself was not delighted with Zion's decision, because she had already begun to wonder what kind of fool she was marrying. Without this party, the girl would have no way of making connections and carrying out her plan to reform the emperor and return to her hometown. After Zion was made a duke, she and Elizabeth sat and drank tea to calm down a little. The woman sighed heavily, not understanding what the emperor could possibly be doing at night. She even suggested that perhaps he would like to spend a wild night with his empress. As soon as Eleanor heard this, she even choked on her drink, because she did not expect such directness from a woman. Elizabeth, seeing her reaction, explained that she had spoken very seriously and asked if she shouldn't have been even more angry than she was. Elizabeth knew about her from rumors, so she did not think it necessary for Eleanor to pretend to be some kind of noble lady for the sake of decency. The girl immediately realized that rumors about her were spreading quite quickly, and after a short silence, she explained to the girl that His Majesty had always been like this. However, it was Zion who irritated her the most. Eleanor thought that they were in the same boat at that moment, but she didn't understand why he didn't think that they should move together, but acted as only he thought. She thought it was all very selfish and narcissistic. In fact, at first people will certainly say that he received the title officially, but then they will say that it was an excuse for the emperor to get rid of Duke Terry. And in the end, they will even start talking about the fact that the emperor does not like Zion, and therefore will do something nasty to him in the future. Eleanor was furious and didn't know what to do. After thinking for a while, a brilliant idea finally occurred to the girl. She turned to her new friend and asked if she would like to tell him that the party had been canceled due to plans for a grand wedding celebration. When Elizabeth heard this proposal, she thought that it was a very good plan. But the Empress was not at all like Eleanor, and she was very sorry for this. Then the woman smiled and said that Princess Dorothy of the Kingdom of Locks wanted to tear off the heads of all those who were distinguished by their intelligence. So she advised Eleanor to be more observant and careful. In fact, no one knew that Roxy was not a real princess, and only members of the royal family knew that she was an illegitimate daughter. So Eleanor tried with all her might to remember what the emperor did when he found out about this, but she realized that she could not remember and had completely forgotten about the existence of such an important moment. At that moment, Elizabeth turned to her and asked what she was thinking about so much. The girl immediately turned to her and asked if it was true that Her Majesty the Empress should be involved in organizing the wedding. When the woman said that it was, Elizabeth asked her to help her meet with the Empress so that she could discuss matters regarding the upcoming wedding. But Elizabeth wasn't going to do that. She smiled and said that she could handle the matter herself, so she shouldn't interfere. In fact, it wasn't a concern at all. She just wanted to take charge of the organization, so she was going to offer her something that might sound tempting to the Duchess. Elena said that if she helps her meet the Empress, then as a thank you, she can give her a magic stone from Azantarium. The girl explained that they would have to get rid of some monsters right after their arrival, so she could send her the stone within a year. After some time of arguing and discussing how much of the stone Eleanor would give her, they finally made the deal. In fact, Elizabeth needed a business partner for the grain trade, and she understood that the girl was not at all the type to betray Zion, so she had no reason to worry about it. Then suddenly a maid knocked on their door and told the ladies that the Duke of Azantarium had arrived. Elizabeth immediately allowed him to enter. The man opened the door and entered the room, looking for some time at the ladies who were sitting nearby. Eleanor looked at the guy in surprise and didn't understand why he even went into the room and not to his home, but all this was explained pretty quickly. Bowing, Zion said that he had come to take Princess Eleanor and thanked her ladyship for looking after the girl. Elizabeth, a little indignant, immediately said that they were now on the same page, so in the future he had better be careful in his actions and words. Zion replied that he would take this into consideration. However, it sounded very rude and distant, so Eleanor frowned, not understanding why such a thing had happened to him at all. She turned to him rather quickly and asked him to just not say anything and keep his mouth shut, then they wouldn't have any problems. After this, the girl stood up and, making a curtsy, thanked the Duchess of Orbis for her hospitality. Elizabeth was a little surprised that she had to leave so quickly, but said that, of course, she could always contact her, and also added that they both should understand that they were not yet spouses, so they did not owe anything to each other. Eleanor, approaching the man, said that everything was fine because they would soon get married, and there would definitely be no problems. And if they hadn't gotten married, their heads would have definitely flown off their shoulders. The girl said that she was indeed right, and even decided to lend her carriage to the two of them, so Eleanor and Zion went home in good conditions. While the boy and the girl were driving, Eleanor asked him if he even realized that he had now become an aristocrat. She also said that all they could do now was walk around and shout that he was a complete idiot. Zion defended himself by saying that perhaps the girl herself had been taught etiquette since she was a child, but he certainly had not. He had been trained more in martial arts. They were silent for a while. Eleanor suddenly wondered why he had refused to host the party and had not insisted on his own way to the emperor. The man, looking at her in surprise, also did not understand why this question was asked at all, because he saw no point in taking her out at all. Eleanor was very irritated by his stupidity, so she sighed heavily and replied that everyone would be told that the party was cancelled only because of plans to hold a grand celebration in honor of the wedding. Therefore, she also said that they would need to meet with Her Majesty the next day. But Zion interrupted her and did not let her finish her thought. He only asked in a rough voice if there was any reason at all to arrange a grand celebration, since neither of them wanted that wedding. Eleanor was then very angry. She did not hesitate to shout at the man, asking if he was a complete idiot. The emperor had asked them to have a lavish wedding, and since this was a chance to prove herself as an empress, His Highness had prepared everything in order to do so. After a while, she calmed down and told the man in a quiet voice that he was an aristocrat and she was a princess and a descendant of the country. And if they did not have a proper wedding, people would look down on them, and they certainly did not need that. Seeing his indifferent expression, Zion knew that maybe he didn't care, but she did. And since this situation had happened, she thought that they should hold a lavish and luxurious wedding at the expense of the imperial treasury. That wedding would have many noble guests, so they would be able to gain very good connections for the future. Eleanor also said that if they went to Azizarium, they might get into financial trouble, so they needed to get as many wedding gifts as possible and take advantage of the imperial family while they still had the chance. When Zion heard all this, he couldn't even hold back his laughter. This made Eleanor even more angry, and she asked why he was laughing at all. Sighing heavily, the man said that she was still very greedy and only thought about money. The girl was quite hot-tempered, so she started yelling at him again. And besides, she grabbed him by the hair, saying that she actually didn't only think about herself, so she didn't understand his nagging. When the next day came, they finally arrived to the empress, who was sitting in her beautiful place and greeting the guests. Eleanor understood that most likely the empress came to the meeting only out of fear of the Duchess of Orbis. And the girl, when she looked at her, noticed that she was rather gloomy, but she did not know why the empress was in such a lost state. In fact, 3 years ago, when she first visited the Kingdom of Locks, she met the real Princess Dorothy. Eleanor supposed that she must be frightened, because the girl knew the real princess. They had only similarities in the color of their eyes and hair. Therefore, the girl decided to tell her about everything a little later, when she would stop being wary and even somehow avoiding her. To break the awkward silence, Eleanor smiled and told Princess Dorothy that they had not seen each other for a long time and that so much time had passed since then that she now had to address her as Empress. The Empress greeted her and then immediately fell silent. Eleanor then continued speaking and said that she had changed a lot during the time they had not seen each other. The girl also suggested that Dorothy had been quite strongly affected by life in a foreign land, and the woman did not deny this. The girl, sitting down next to Zion on the couch, said that she could treat them freely because they had come to discuss with her questions about the wedding. Eleanor said that they decided to have a lavish wedding party, since His Majesty had linked their destinies. Dorothy was not even surprised when she heard this, because she also believed that this should be done. The girl then said that in such a case, it was necessary to immediately prepare and invite as many guests as possible so that everyone could see their beautiful couple and admire the wedding that they had organized. The Empress agreed with her, but Eleanor was already beginning to doubt whether she even understood what this conversation was leading to, so she decided to clarify that first they needed to get engaged and then arrange a wedding. When the woman heard this, she was a little surprised, because she had never heard of such a thing before, so she asked what the method consisted of. Eleanor immediately said that after the engagement ceremony, they should invite other noble ladies to the palace for a hen party, and the wedding should take place in the traditional manner in the banquet hall of the palace. They discussed various details of the wedding and engagement until quite late. So as soon as they left the Empress's estate, they noticed that the sun had already begun to set behind the horizon. It became very cold outside by the evening, so Zion, like a true gentleman, shared his jacket with his bride so that she would not freeze on the way home. As they moved forward, Eleanor felt a little uncomfortable, so she turned to the man and said that he had indeed not said a single word. So she added that he could now complain if he had anything to say. But Zion, walking forward, replied in a cold voice that she could do as she saw fit, since he didn't care at all about the details of their wedding, engagement, and all that. The girl didn't even suspect that he had said this on purpose, so she smiled and replied that since he was giving her complete freedom, then of course she wasn't an idiot to refuse such an opportunity. They walked in silence for some time. After that, the man began to wonder if it was true that this was not the first time she had met Her Majesty, for he had listened attentively to their conversation. Eleanor was surprised that he remembered such a small detail, but she explained that she was the first princess of one country and then asked, did he really think that she had never met other princesses from neighboring countries? But when the girl noticed that he had quickened his pace, she immediately realized that she shouldn't have spoken in that tone, so she decided to explain the whole situation in detail and not push him so hard. In fact, Eleanor thought that she and Zion were in the same boat, so it was surprising to her that he didn't think they should move together. And the man was just doing what he thought was right, and it was pretty selfish of him. So she decided to ask if it was true that he refused to attack the Brodies in order not to continue this senseless war. The man, for whom this topic was quite a sore point, immediately looked at her in surprise, asking why she had even brought it up again, since he thought it was already over. Then he suddenly realized that he had crossed the line a little, because at such a moment he should not be angry with her, and especially not raise his tone like that. So he immediately asked her for forgiveness and said that he would not speak like that anymore. But Eleanor decided to change the subject and asked about Locks, since she knew he was the commander at the time. By that time they had already approached the carriage, and before getting into it, Zion asked one very important question. Does the girl even know why this war began?